going to briefly talk about role transition. I won't read all the slides to you, but I just want to make sure that you kind of at least get some overview to this, because you all are getting ready to embark on a big role transition. Often your textbook is going to talk about, because it is talking about leadership and managerial roles, how do people make the best transition to leadership roles. But of course, you guys are making a big role transition to become a practicing nurse. So some of this has application to the transitions you're getting ready to go through, but also be thinking about it in terms of that leader and how they're making a transition to a leadership role, because often that's kind of the focus of some of these kinds of questions that you might see on NCLEX, and just like how do people prepare to be nurse leaders. So these are some of the main objectives. I won't read those to you, but you'll see this throughout your textbook. And then also kind of like what are some of these frameworks that people use, and what are some of the key elements, and how they kind of have some application to a role transition, and particularly a leadership role transition. Key to know is there is always usually support in the society or in the organizational climate in which you're in for, making transitions. So, as much as you don't think about it, like you're getting ready to graduate nursing school, and something like a graduation is a show of support from your own society that you're in terms of you're making a big transition. So you often are going to see that in the workplace there are many things that kind of come together when a transition takes place, where your work environment group moves to support you as you make a transition. And if that's moving up to a new job or a new unit or a leadership position, usually they're going to have something that shows support. Even when you have a job change, like it says, it involves farewell kinds of parties. We're really big about doing that, and so it's like letting the person know that you're there for them. And so lack of support in that way often can make the person making that role transition a little bit less settled and less confident. So here's some key things when you think about transitions. What are some markers occur? What happens when you get engaged? What happens when you get married? What happens if you get divorced? What if you're losing a job? What if you're downsizing your organization? You move from one employer to another. That's a big transition. People go through a significant amount of stress through any of big transitions in their life, and moving from a leadership position within, an organization, and even within a unit sometimes, can be highly stressful, because now you're not just doing the same old task and things that people know you to have excelled and learned how to be really good at what you're doing right now, or you wouldn't be moving up. But at the same time, now you're a novice in the new role. And so it's like I'm starting all over in terms of building self-confidence, building your skill set. So it's difficult often. So changes in roles can either be painful or they can be exciting. Sometimes they can be both. But often how well those are perceived are based really on the kind of work culture that you have and the level of support that's being provided. And secondly, whether the role transition is something that's been expected and you've kind of had a plan of how to move up in an organization, or whether this was some huge change that happened quickly and you had no time to plan. There's often a huge fear of the unknown. Sometimes there's role confusion. There is resistance to change. that plays into the transition. So just those are kind of the backdrop of what can be positive and negative about a transition. Also, within nursing roles, whether you're being a leader or just a regular staff nurse, you have different roles within a role. So you may be a leader part of the time, you may be a manager of people or managing process, you may be expected to be a follower at sometimes, and sometimes these kind of intertwining roles can come into conflict because you want to lead, but maybe your boss is not ready for you to be a lead. They want you to follow their direction. So sometimes we can have just that whole transition between intertwining roles within a role that make it difficult to handle. These are just some examples of leader, manager, and follower roles. Like how do you lead your peers through something? And that may be nursing peers, that could be peers outside of in other departments. As a manager, you're going to interact with people being supervised. You're going to also try to figure out how to deal with administrators and supervisors to kind of influence them in your roles related to that, as well as how do you handle regulatory agencies coming into your building. And then following, what kind of a follower are you? Are you really following the supervisor's key mandates? Are you a blind follower, or do you lead it sometimes and let them lead at others? And how do you navigate getting into the right nuances of that? There is this model called the roles model, and it's kind of an easy acronym to just remember some of the key things that deals with role transitions. And some of these are just the key elements, and I'll hit on those briefly. Responsibilities. Each position has a specific set of tasks that are associated with it for which the person that's in that position is responsible. If you guys are starting in new jobs, you're going to all be asked to review a job description when you start a job, and you're going to look through that. You might have competency checklist for a specific unit that outline, okay, in this unit I have to do X, Y, and Z, whereas in another unit I might not be responsible for that. So that's a huge amount of tasks and responsibilities to totally understand, and in healthcare that's often changing. So we frequently see that job descriptions do not keep pace with the changes. So you may have memos, you may have other things that outline some of these responsibilities that are just constantly coming out and changing. And so the best you can do in terms of adopting your role properly is really staying attuned to what am I responsible for and keeping that always at the forefront of what you're doing. The O in this model deals with opportunities. Leaders often have a huge opportunity in being in that role to influence organizational and unit goals. And if you're really a good leader, you're going to seek those kinds of opportunities out. If you're not so great of a leader or not very good in that, you're not going to really look at how can I expand my role? How can my role support something else? How can we get my unit to a certain level of something? If you're not forward thinking, not a little bit visionary, and not everybody's real skilled at that. That's a skill that you learn, is how do you influence and look for those opportunities. You're going to more likely find them than if you're never looking for them. So a key point in terms of the role. L deals with lines of communication, and we have a whole chapter and lecture related to communication. So this just kind of reiterates some of those key things. When we talk about organizational structures here in a few weeks, you're going to see that lines of communication are formal and informal. So sometimes some things are put in place so we know that specific lines of communication are followed. There may be policies that outline some of this in terms of who can, tell what to whom, or who can has the authority to have certain lines of communication. So that's another piece besides the skillfulness of listening and sending messages and being clear in our messages. Expectations, we've already talked a little bit about, but often you have some role confusion between departments, between levels in an organization. And so the best way to ensure that roles are really well understood, again, is to make sure that the expectations are really there. It's not uncommon to come into jobs in an agency as a nurse manager or leader, and you look at the job descriptions and you find that it's very unclear between two different positions who is responsible for specific tasks. And so the more you can clear that up, the better your employees are going to really understand their role, and you'll have less role confusion. The S in roles deals with support, and as I mentioned earlier, you want a level of support. When you're thinking about a new position is being considered, it's really to evaluate whether support is available. You're going to hire somebody into a role, and you're like, do I have enough support to really ensure this person's going to be successful? So anytime that you're working in that kind of mindset, you want to not just throw people in. For you who are beginning to come into a new job role as a new staff nurse, think about, as you're moving into it, to be very frank and open with the level of support you feel like you need. It is a strength to communicate your needs versus, pretend to be too confident and then not do well. This slide talks a little bit about the benefits of mentoring. This is not, you all have probably had some mentors before who've helped you in different things. You're getting ready to have a preceptor as a new graduate, and so sometimes that preceptor will just be a functional preceptor to get you through different tasks being checked off. Sometimes those people will actually be true mentors that really help you at different times throughout your career. You'll make connections that really not only get you through the task at hand, but also help you to develop a larger network so that you're successful beyond working with them. So most people kind of have at some point had a transition that was a bad one or had a transition that was a good one. And so these are just some things when you're thinking about moving into leadership roles. It's really bad form to demean the predecessors that might have been in that job role before you. You don't want to cover up something if it was not great, but at the same time, you don't want to be really negative towards that person because people have worked with that person before. You want to make sure that you acknowledge previous things that team has done well together, but then focus on celebrating things as they move through transitions, or as you move with them through transitions. And so this just kind of gives you an idea of some do's and don'ts perhaps to think about. The best way to promote success is to really know what resources you have, both internally and externally. So this week when we did self-assessments and you're thinking about what is it that I do well, what is it that I could be good at? Could I be good at this? What if I'm not good at something? How do I go out and seek a good mentor, a sponsor, a coach? How do I get extra education so I'm ready to take on that role? But you have to be good at understanding self to be able to move forward. Making the smooth transition to the next role you assume depends on your personal strengths and your abilities on capitalizing on those strengths and using the resources of your organization. So make sure that you really think about that as you go through your career. These are just some of the